On today's World Insight, Iran grapples with the fallout from the shot-down Ukrainian airliner. How can peace be restored at this critical juncture? And how will the Davos Forum reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? I speak to David Eichmann, the World Economic Forum's Chief Representative Officer in China, to find out more.
Of their daily business and look over the horizon, lift their heads up out of the business and look to the longer term.
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show in Iran, where anti-government protests entered their third day. The demonstrations were in response to Iran unintentionally shooting down a passenger plane. Iran has since made arrests against those responsible. In the 10 days since the United States killed Iran's most powerful military commander in a drone strike, Tehran has faced pressure at home and abroad, both reaching levels with little precedent in its modern history. Before we get on to a discussion with stakeholders from different parts of the world, take a look at the latest.
Protests continue in Iran, but against whom? That keeps changing. Before Saturday, Iranians were united against America in their mourning of the assassinated general Qasem Soleimani. But outrage turned to their own government when the Iranian military admitted to have accidentally killed 176 innocent people on board a commercial flight from Tehran to Kiev. Despite apologies from authorities, anger has been exacerbated by the Iranian government's initial denial of shooting down the plane. The Ukrainian airline accident happened just hours after Iran had launched missiles at U.S. targets in Iraq, a retaliatory strike that resulted in no casualties. World leaders are calling for de-escalation, and European powers are working to somehow revive the nuclear deal which the U.S. abandoned, and Tehran has stopped abiding too. Ukraine, once again put under international spotlight, says the 5 nations whose citizens died in the crash will meet in London on Thursday to discuss possible legal action. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said on Monday that the victims would still be alive and at home with their families now if there had been no tension in the region.
For more on Iran downing of the Ukraine plane, we are joined by Mohsen Milani in Tampa. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and Professor of Politics from University of South Florida. In Washington, D.C., we have Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. In Beijing, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First, I want to go to you, Professor Milani. With the arrest of a few dozens in Iran supposedly responsible for the attack on the passenger jet, do you think the mood of the country can be calmed down? Do you think criticism against Iran will somewhat reduced from the current circumstances, Professor?
Good day, and thank you for having me in your program. I think the arrest of a few individuals is the right step in the right direction, but the Islamic Republic has to go much further than that, because what we have seen in the past few days is the total collapse of public confidence in the way the government has managed that. They have made major egregious errors on every step of the way. They made a mistake by shooting down a civilian aircraft. It is clear that there are fundamental problems, systemic problems with the way the Iranian air defense system operates. They made a huge mistake in terms of informing the public about the incident. They should not have allowed any civilian aircraft to go off the Iranian airport when they already had attacked an American base in Iraq. And finally, for a few days, they were not honest with the Iranians. So the population, many Iranians feel that they were deceived, and they are angry, and the Islamic Republic did not even do a good job in terms of managing the grief people felt.
I see.
So the arrest is the right move on the right direction, but they have to do much more than that.
Mr. Ilan, from the U.S. perspective, of course, this is a crisis going on inside Iran. Do you think Washington take advantage of that? When taking advantage of the current situation, will that necessarily be gains, political gains for Washington, or likely more fire if not careful?
Well, I think the situation is still serious because I think Iran will retaliate, but Iran is basically this symbolic retaliation or ineffective retaliation that they did, which ultimately caused this tragedy, which I do think was accidental. And as your other guest said, it's totally incompetent on the part of the Iranian government. However, the military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran are not over. I think it's just moved to a playing field where the Iranians can have more advantage, that is indirect attacks on the U.S. targets through proxies in the Middle East. Now, as far as the shoot-down goes, I'm not sure they should arrest people because I think that the Iranian government's been so incompetent, not prohibiting civilian aircraft from going through this area when there was a confrontation between the U.S. and Iran, and also lying about it for 3 days. So I'm not sure arresting people is really the right thing. There certainly was failures in the aircraft identification area in their air defense system. There's no doubt about that. But it may not be the people's fault, and maybe the equipment or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, maybe they do deserve to be arrested, but I'm not quite sure. But it seems to be the whole system is broken.
All right. Mr. Lee, it's no doubt there were mistakes being committed by the Iranian side, shooting down the passenger plane, that's for sure. On the other hand, what do you make of the latest statements coming out by the Iranian president, Mr. Hassan Rouhani? And how do you think his comments, for example, the rest of the world is watching us as to how we are dealing with this, is creating some kinds of discussion within the country of Iran, Mr. Lee?
I think, the Iranian government, certainly President Rouhani, has vehemently denied there's any cover-up or try any efforts to deceive the Iranian people to know exactly what happened that night. And he said, he received the reports from the army only, from the last, the Friday, almost, 3 days after that tragic events. And then, he openly, to admitted this is a man-made, the error, and he apologize to all, the people on board as well as the Iranian people, and also he called for a kind of international and coordinating and to form or international kind of forms to investigate what exactly happened, and also to discuss what kind of and how much of the compensations will be paid for the people. And so far, I think people are waiting for this code of the black box, and there have been some the stories and also some speculations about the real causes of the army shoot down this plane. So my personal is that we have to be a little bit patient and do not jump any conclusion. Let's wait for I think the final results of this kind of investigation to see the real causes of these tragic events.
Okay. Professor Milani, the U.S. president has already identified himself with the protesters on the streets in Iran. However, people have also pointed out the two possibilities that this action or claim could run positively or negatively for the United States as well. Professor Milani, how do you see that?
Well, let's not mix a few issues. Number one, when the Americans killed Qasem Soleimani, a lot of people in Iran became very angry. It is true that the U.S. government considered the Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization, and therefore their claim is that they have killed Qasem Soleimani, who was a terrorist. But to the Islamic Republic of Iran and to many people in Iran, Qasem Soleimani in reality was a uniformed general serving the Iranian armed forces. And therefore, when he was killed, it really made a lot of Iranians angry. I think Iranian nationalists, Iranian patriots were angry that America had killed a uniformed general. So millions of people poured into the streets. The opponent of the Islamic Republic claimed that the government was behind these demonstrations. I'm pretty sure the government was behind these demonstrations. But the past 40 years, they were never been able to bring so many people out to the streets. Yes, they were behind it, but there was also an authentic opposition to what the Americans did. And then came the shooting down of a Ukrainian aircraft. Your guest from Washington is absolutely correct. Iran most likely had made a mistake. As the other guest said, we have to be patient to find out exactly what has happened. But we don't have to be patient about one thing. The Iranian government lied to its people. It was a big mistake. They should have come out and should have admitted that they did this, but they're going to investigate. And now, as a result of that huge mistake, we are at a very critical juncture in Iranian-U.S. relationship.
So we see several things going on all at the same time. One, of course, is not necessarily the same nature of the other. One is the passenger jet, which is the problem of the Iranian side. The other is, of course, the killing of an Iranian general without notifying both the Congress and also the allies, and also doing it in a way that is against the norms of international rules. Then we also have a Iranian nuclear crisis going on at the same time. And now let's move on to that, which is very interesting, Mr. Eland. As we have seen the Europeans, UK, Germany, as well as France coming out and suggesting, let's push this to the UN, the United Nations, rather than the framework of JCPOA, which is going to be much more complicated than the current situation. Now, Mr. Eland, the U.S. is a member of the Permanent Five. However, the U.S. has long withdrawn from the treaty. Should the U.S. also be put to the United Nations together with the Iranians in this regard, Mr. Eland?
Well, I guess you could, but you know, with the veto power that the U.S. has, certainly I think the U.S. is to blame for all this to start, because after they went away from the agreement, they pulled out of the agreement, then we saw Iranian attacks on U.S. Facilities through these militias increase. Then, of course, the U.S. assassinated their second most powerful person in Iran. And then, of course, you got these anti-U.S. protests. But, of course, there had been anti-Iranian government protests before, so the U.S. kind of shot itself in the foot. As we see the Iranian population, this shoot down of the airliner was certainly bad, but this is only a symptom of the larger problem that the Iranian people have with their government. But the United States is getting in the way. When your adversary is having problems, you just stay out of it rather than diving in with both feet, as President Trump did by assassinating one of their leaders.
Okay, Mr. Eland, but my question directly is, you know, should we also punish those who have tried to withdraw from already agreed upon international treaties or agreement? In that case, what about the fate of the United States?
Well, you can.
Meanwhile, how should we make of, sir, Mr. Eland, the Europeans' reaction so far? It seems that it is adding oil to the fire at this moment, pushing it, the Iranian nuclear issue, to the United Nations, Mr. Eland.
Well, I think the Europeans are concerned that the whole thing is falling apart because of the Iranian reaction to the assassination. But of course, the agreement was already largely in big trouble anyway after the U.S. pulled out. And I don't think you can necessarily I guess you can condemn the U.S. for pulling out of it, but there's very little you can do else because the United States can pull out of the agreement and did, and so it's a great power, and so I disagree with the fact that the United States government pulled out, but I'm not sure, you know, the UN tends to be kind of feckless anyway, because any one of the powers, China, Russia, US, France, or Britain, who sit on the Security Council can veto anything they don't like.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure that's a good forum to place this. It can place additional pressure on the U.S. and Iran to get back to the table, and if it does that, then it's okay, I guess, but it's not going to achieve that much.
Mr. Lee, your assessment about that too?
I think, you know, so far the Europeans, I believe, has not made their final minds yet. You know, you can see on the one hand, the Europeans still made very clear that, you know, they want to preserve the JCPOA. They, you know, call for Iranian to return to the framework of the GCP to implement you know, the Iranians' obligations. But on the other hand, you know, the Europeans has give a kind of a warning to the Iranians. You know, if Iranians has not returned to what they should do according to the GCPOA, they would, you know, to bring this issue to the UN Security Council, and because you know we know that there is you know dispute mechanism, and which requires all parties to solve their problems or disputes within the 15 days. If they have not reached any solution yet, then you know the snapback of internal sanctions will be on Iranians. So you know this is a kind of a warning. But the Europeans are also very clear. Once you know the Iranians has been received in the international sanctions again, then it's the time of collapse of the GCPOA.
Okay. Money is an issue since you talk about sanctions. Whether it's money coming from oil or it's the money of the economy. Professor Milani, therefore, I want to come back to you and talk about, according to Iranian insurance company, the loss that's likely to be compensated will be as much as $150 million US, to say the least. Now, that's only according to one source. I do not know the exact number. We do not have it on the record right now. So, Professor Milani, how are we going to see Iran as a country be able to work on those issues from now on, as we have heard very strongly from countries that are having their citizens killed in the passenger jet crash?
Yes, Iran will have to pay compensation to the innocent victims of this tragedy. However, it's going to take many years before there could be a settlement. So Iran has a number of years to work on this project. Remember when the Americans accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian aircraft in the 1980s. It took many years before the U.S. was willing to pay compensation to the Iranians. So I think financially it's going to be very burdensome for Iran, but I think it is too early to talk about what kind of compensation we have to have. But may I just go back to the question you asked the other two distinguished guests about Article 7 of the nuclear deal with Iran. It is very important to point out that the Europeans, the three major European powers, have been insisting that they want to keep the JCPOA intact. They wanted to protect it. But unfortunately, they have not paid any political price for protecting this. And it is very clear that they are in complete alliance with the United States. The only two countries that helped protect the JCPOA, number one is China, and number two is Russia. And even if they succeed in the next 60 days, which is the period in which Iran has to negotiate with the Europeans, they might be able to snap back the European sanctions. But if it goes to the United Nations, I am not very sure that they can reimpose international sanctions. We already know that the British Prime Minister is already talking about a new Trump deal with Iran. So these next 60 days are going to be crucial, and I hope that somehow Iran and the global powers can come out with an agreement how to save the nuclear deal or how to come out with a new nuclear deal.
Things are getting ever more complicated. It's not just the early agreement, but also the complicated process to bring in all the stakeholders in a way as to where is the direction, particularly with the recent events. Now, Mr. Li, about China, I want to ask you about that. Since your Iranian guest particularly mentioned about China's role, what do you make, how would you assess exactly is the China role so far?
I think with regard to the JCPOA, China has played a very important role to, to manage, make the deal, to mediate between the United States and, the Iran at the time of the negotiations. But so far, I think, China, as we say that, we have implemented what we should do according to the JCPOA. But, the U.S. has, exercised maximum pressures on every country if they implement, if they have do any business with, the Iranians. And so we say that, what we do is, we may insist and, what China has to do is according to the UN resolutions as well as international agreements. We say, that both countries has the right to do business all together.
All right. Mr. Eland, now I don't want to make things too complicated, but sometimes geopolitics is complicated, unfortunately, and probably interestingly. So let me ask you this. China and U.S. have already designed a time to sign the first phase trade agreement later this week. Now, many scholars from both sides have been suggesting in terms of global governance, that when the two countries are working together on issues, the bilateral relations would even miraculously become better. So now, on the issue of Iran, since the U.S. is in quite an interesting position so far, particularly with the killing of the Iranian top general, will China and the U.S. have the possibility in an election year, which an international crisis is no good for any president in the U.S. history, will be able to work something together toward a common goal of making peace on the issue of Iran nuclear issue? Go ahead, sir, Mr. Eland.
Well, of course, I would like to see them go back to the negotiating table and get a new agreement, since the old one is apparently, dead. But I'm not sure, and I think China could help mediate that. But the problem is the escalation has happened already, and I'm afraid the Iranians are not going to be satisfied with the retaliation that they had, because, of course, this was a senior official in their government. And so I think that the Iranians may have an incentive to, and I think some of the Iranian officials have even said that they have an incentive to try to undermine Trump's election, as they did with Jimmy Carter back in the hostage crisis days of the late 70s. So, I don't think this Iran thing is going away, and that could have a serious impact if they can do that, if they can keep attacking U.S. targets.
We're running out of time. There are a lot to cover, even for 24 hours. During the day, there are a lot of interesting developments, to say the least. But for now, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion. I'm sure we're going to have future opportunities to discuss more. Hossein Milani, Ivan Eland, and Li Guofu, thank you. You're watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. How will the Davos Forum, another year of Davos, World Economic Forum, in other words, reinvent itself for its 50th anniversary? I speak to David Aikman, the World Economic Forum's chief representative here in China, to find out more. Welcome back. This is World Insight, and I'm Tian Wei. It's another year where the world's political and business leaders are crowding into the snow-covered Swiss mountain town of Davos. This year's World Economic Forum annual meeting will be held on January the 21st to the 24th, with the theme of Stakeholders for a Cohesive and Sustainable World. Now, on its 50th anniversary, the annual Jamboree is expected to be a bigger affair, addressing the most pressing realities of our time. Earlier, I spoke to David Aikman, the WEF's Chief Representative Officer in China. He explains how Davos, after 5 decades, still remain relevant at providing solutions for a changing world. Let's listen in. What a pleasure to have you on CGTN.
Thank you.
Another year of Davos, but very different this time. 50th anniversary. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
There is one question. When we talk about 50 years, World Economic Forum was very relevant at a time when the world has been changing so fast over the past 5 decades. But what about from now on, as the world is changing in a very different logic, and the World Economic Forum is based in Europe? So how is it going to make it relevant?
Well, I think one of the ways the World Economic Forum has been relevant for the last 50 years has been to always be ahead of the curve. The reason why we hold the annual meeting in January is because we get leaders to step out of their daily business and look over the horizon, lift their heads up out of the business and look for the longer term. And I think that's one of the things that's really helped us with our relevance. And now as we look to the next 50 years, what we see is the need to really renew business's mandate with society. And that's why we've created the theme this year around the stakeholders theory, coming back to our origins, if you will. Because 50 years ago, our organization was founded on the notion that all of the stakeholders of society need to work together to improve the state of the world.
I have to question, because now people even find it difficult to know what's going to happen in 5 days. Not to even mention 5 months, 5 years, or even 50 years. So how would, a place like a World Economic Forum, where is the energy of thinking is coming from over the past decades, continue to play that role? It's just a big question mark to me.
At the origin, back in 1973, in our 3rd year of operation, we launched something called the Davos Manifesto. And we're bringing it back again this year, which is looking at business's role in society. Because we feel that although over the last decades, business has really profited, society is not doing so well. Many of the fragments and cracks that we've been talking about for the last 5 or 6 years are now reaching fracture zones. It's like a tectonic shift. It's a state of emergency. It's a state of crisis. And if we don't do something to redress the balance, particularly around economic inequality and around climate change, we are in big trouble, not just for the next 50 years, but for the next 5 years. So we feel a real sense of urgency of bringing the leaders together and renewing that mandate with society to look at how capitalism and globalization can serve society, not just the business interests. For
a kid like Greta, she has to speak out in order to make sure that her future will be not devastating. In a way, it's awkward, isn't it, for the World Economic Forum, because the World Economic Forum hasn't achieved that, some would argue. David?
We've been calling for years about this problem. I think Klaus Schwab, our founder and executive chairman, started talking about the economic inequalities and the dangers of globalization back in 1996. And so, it's our job to focus the attention of leaders and to really get them to pay attention to this. After that, it's up to governments to pass laws. It's up to companies to change their standards. And what I'm encouraged about this year is the fact that we've got so many different leaders who are ready to commit to these new standards. They're ready to sign up for these new ESG principles. We are hoping that over 100 countries are going to be announcing new rules on trade facilitation to try and fix some of the cracks in the current trade system. So we're really looking for those tangible commitments, and it's our job to then hold people accountable year on year.
What is that trade facilitation issue is likely to be? How are economies going to commit to that?
One of the things we've seen, the challenges with the current trade system is It doesn't necessarily have the right guidelines and standards in place for digital trade and the trade of e-commerce and so on. So there's been a huge initiative over the last 2 years between the World Economic Forum, the WTO, and some of the big e-commerce giants worldwide to see what can be done to improve this environment. And so we're hoping to be able to announce some positive steps there.
The U.S. president committed to come to Davos last year, didn't show up. Now, how is the World Economic Forum prepared for all options?
You know, it's always a challenge for us with leaders' agenda. I think this year, for example, we bump right up against Chinese New Year, which makes it much more difficult for our Chinese participants to join. So we always have these scheduling challenges, and as world and domestic events spring up, sometimes leaders do have to cancel their participation. But this year we have over 60 heads of state engaged, 280 public figures, and oftentimes what we find is we have strong delegations with all of the key ministers from trade, from commerce, from the economy, from science and technology, environment. So even if a given leader is not able to participate in 1 year or due to circumstances, we still have delegations which can do that important work. And as I said, you know, so much work takes place in the closed-door meetings where we really want things happening at the working level. So
sometimes getting a room to have a meeting is a problem.
It is a challenge. Davos is a small resort that doesn't have the right infrastructure. But you know, the wonderful thing about Davos, and you know, it's grown up with the World Economic Forum over the last 50 years, is in such a small village, people are really forced to be together. They sit on the shuttle together, they ride up in the cable cars together, and that personal human contact is very important.
Nothing could replace that, in fact. Yeah. Another thing, the World Economic Forum falls this time after, possibly, China and the United States signed the first phase of the trade deal. Now, we don't want to overstate the significance of the first phase of this trade deal, but it could provide certain kind of ambience to the World Economic Forum meeting, which is, after all, about trade, economic ties, about globalization. So, David, from the world economics perspective, how to engage with these two economies, and in what way? How would you be able to serve as a platform? What role would you, the World Economic Forum, play in this regard?
Well, I think it's important that the world's two largest economies work together and find creative and collaborative solutions. I think the IMF estimated that the damage to the world economy was nearly 0.8% of global GDP in terms of the trade tensions, causing slowdown to the global markets. Yeah. So we, like many economists, we feel that just because the phase one trade deal has been signed doesn't mean it's the end of discussions, and now more energy and more creativity is going to be needed in the next phase.
Chinese President Xi Jinping made a speech at the World Economic Forum a few years ago. At the time, people were very enthusiastic about the content of that speech and the attitude China has shown toward globalization and leadership. Now, things have been evolving since then, of course, in a very dramatic way all over the world. So, David, how do you see, from the World Economic Forum's perspective, China is today? And how do you see the possibility that we can make efforts so that the world will not be further divided?
I think it's very interesting that the words that President Xi said in 2017 about needing to learn how to swim together in the ocean of globalization still ring true today. Everything that he said in that speech about not turning your back on globalization, about further opening up, and that all the nations need to work together to create that shared destiny for humanity, all of that is still true. And if you look in the last 2 years, China has not slowed the pace of reform and opening up. In fact, at our summer Davos meeting last summer, Premier Li Keqiang announced that they would be advancing the opening up of financial markets by even 1 year. So in fact, China has maintained its commitment and its efforts to continue that reform and opening up in the face of a context global context, which is more challenging and more difficult.
How do you see the science and technology, which used to be a common ground for human beings, and now at a very different stage, and how is World Economic Forum going to be able to strengthen the still existing ties about that area?
I mean, the reality is that technology and scientific breakthroughs are going to continue to fuel and to drive the world forward. I mean, that's why we've called it the fourth industrial revolution.
That's
because
right.
We do feel that it's a technological revolution, and it's something that is very difficult to master. It's very difficult to take control of. I think you'll see different sessions in Davos around preventing a technology Cold War and different things like this, because we do recognize that technology governance has become a sort of a battleground of ideologies and of economies and so on. Again, what's important, I think, is to bring the different voices together, to have them discuss, and to explore those areas where we really do need this interoperability. You know, it's not enough for these systems. I mean, can you imagine your self-driving car which stops at the border because it doesn't have the way to operate with the system next door? I mean, we wouldn't accept this, and so we need to pull the leaders together and to say, let's not focus on the rivalries, let's not focus on the competition. The strategic competition will already be there. Let's focus on the areas where we need collaboration, where we need global standards for safety, where we need, you know, because if you think from society's perspective, if you think from the consumer's perspective, you need to find solutions to these rivalries. So we don't see, you know, the technological competition going away, but we're trying to find ways of creating cooperation around some of these technology issues, and also fostering environments where we can talk about governance.
Congratulations about all of these wonderful ideas.
Well, I think it's also inspiration from China, wasn't it, Zhou Enlai, who said we need to work on our cooperation while reserving our differences. So we'll put the differences aside and we'll work on the cooperation.
You learn a lot about China wisdom. Finally, before we go, David, I know you are moving the World Economic Forum into a brand new office, so that's wonderful. And I wonder, how is the China office or the Beijing representative office of the World Economic Forum likely to play its role in the future?
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our new offices. It's great to have you here for our annual gathering.
I'm in red about 50 years and the first visit.
And you know, it shows actually the growing importance, I think, of the World Economic Forum. In the last 5 years, we've more than doubled the engagement of Chinese companies who participate in the World Economic Forum. We've been very privileged to host senior leaders like President Xi in 2017. I think that reflects China's real appreciation and understanding for the way in which the World Economic Forum, as this neutral and impartial independent platform, can really help China with its global efforts. It can help be a bridge to China reaching out to the world, whether that's through the government side or whether that's in the corporate side. So many of the Chinese companies have gotten involved with the World Economic Forum because they said, look, as we go global, whether it's to the ASEAN region, whether it's to Europe, whether it's truly going global, we struggle with the way to work with government, to work with civil society, to understand these new markets. And so being part of these working groups and these initiatives that are working together with other companies, working together with governments, it allows them a way to build trust, or allows them to build relationships on topics that they care about in markets that are important to them. So I do see a bright future for the World Economic Forum in China, because I think we serve a very important function for China to deepen its engagement and to have more leader-to-leader exchange with countries from around the world. So hopefully this new office will be a nice place to receive our visitors from abroad and to host interesting events that will really serve that purpose.
David Aikman, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I appreciate
it. Appreciate it.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. The World Economic Forum this year is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and the forum, also known as Winter Davos, will be held next week. And I will be there bringing you all the latest, together with exclusive interviews with all of the influential people over there from different walks of life, as they say, the stakeholders. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into the search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook as well. I'm Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in next time. More insight across China and around the world. Good night.